Occitan literature is a body of texts written in Occitan, mostly in the south of France. It was the first literature in a Romance language and inspired the rise of vernacular literature throughout medieval Europe. Occitan literature's golden age was in the 12th century, when a rich and complex body of lyrical poetry was produced by troubadours writing in Old Occitan. However, it does survive to these days. Although Catalan is considered by some a variety of Occitan, this article will not deal with Catalan literature, which started diverging from its southern French counterpart in the late 13th century. Introduction. Occitan literature started in the 11th century in several centers. It gradually spread from there, first over the greater portion of southern France, and then into Catalonia, Galicia, Castile, Portugal and into what is now the north of Italy. In its rise, Occitan literature stands completely by itself, and in its development it long continued to be highly original. It presents at several points analogies with French literature, but these analogies are due principally to certain primary elements common to both, and only in a slight degree to mutual reaction. Origin. Occitan poetry first appeared in the 11th century. The oldest surviving text is the Provençal burden attached to a 10th-century Latin poem. The text has not yet been satisfactorily interpreted. The quality of the earliest remaining works suggests earlier work was lost. The earliest Occitan poem is a 10th-century, 17-line charm tome de femina, probably for dispersing the pain of childbirth. Much longer is an 11th-century fragment of 257 decasyllabic verses preserved in an Orleans manuscript, first printed by Reynaud. It is believed to have come from Limousin, a marsh in the north of the Occitan region. The unknown author takes Boethius's treatise De Consolatione Philosophiae as the groundwork of his composition. The poem is a didactic piece composed by Clark. The Canto de Santa Fe dates from 1054 to 76, but probably represents a Catalan dialect that evolved into a distinct language from Occitan. For the same century there is Las Qui non son sparvir astur, a secular love poem. For the next century are the poems of William IX, the grandfather of Eleanor of Aquitaine. They consist of 11 diverse strophic pieces, and were consequently meant to be sung. Several are love songs. The only one which can be approximately dated was composed around 1119, when William was setting out for Spain to fight the Saracens. It expresses the writer's regret for the frivolity of his past life and his apprehensions as he bade farewell to his country and his young son. We also know from Audricus Vitalis that William had composed various poems on the incidents of his ill-fated crusade of 1101. In one of his pieces, he makes an allusion to the Parchment. The origins of this poetry are uncertain. It bears no relation to Latin poetry, nor to folklore. Vernacular compositions seem to have been at first produced for the amusement, or in the case of religious poetry, for the edification, of that part of lay society which had leisure and lands, and reckoned intellectual pastime among the good things of life. In the 11th century, vernacular poetry served mainly the amusement and edification of the upper class. By the 12th and 13th centuries, historical works and popular treatises on contemporary science were composed in the vernacular. Occitan poetry may have originated amongst the jesters. Some, leaving buffoonery to the ruder and less intelligent members of the profession, devoted themselves to the composition of pieces intended for singing. In the north, the jesters produced chansons de geste full of tales of battle and combat. In the courts of the southern nobles they produced love songs. The age of the Troubadours, starting in the early 12th century. The best-known body of Occitan literature originated with the group of poets who would later become known as troubadours, for the verb troubar, meaning to invent. The troubadours used a standardized form of Old Occitan, sang the pieces to music and generally used complex and elaborate meters. The poetry was usually lyrical, with a minority of pieces of satirical, political, moralistic, religious, or erotic nature. The early period. The first known troubadour was William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, whose works gave the movement a position of honor, and indirectly contributed in a very powerful degree to ensure its development and preservation. Shortly after him, centers of poetic activity made their appearance in various places, first in Limousin and Gascony. In the former province lived Ebola's cantator, who during the second part of William of Poitiers' life seems to have been brought into relation with him, and according to a contemporary historian, Geoffroy, prior of Vigeois, erat val de graciosis incantileness. None of his compositions survive, but under his influence Bernard of Ventadour was trained to poetry, who, though only the son of one of the serving men of the castle, managed to gain the love of the Lady of Ventadour, and when on the discovery of their amour he had to depart elsewhere, received a gracious welcome from Eleanor of Aquitaine, consort of Henry II of England. Of Bernard's compositions we possess about 50 songs of elegant simplicity, some of which may be taken as the most perfect specimens of love poetry Occitan literature has ever produced. Bernard must therefore have been in repute before the middle of the 12th century, and his poetic career extended well on towards its close. At the same period, or probably a little earlier, flourished Chanson, of genuine importance among the troubadours, both because of his early date and because definite information regarding him has been preserved. He was a Gascon, and composed, says his old biographer, pastorals according to the ancient custom. This is the record of the appearance in the south of France of a poetic form which ultimately acquired large development. The period at which Chanson lived is determined by a piece where he alludes very clearly to the approaching marriage of the King of France, Louis VII, with Eleanor of Aquitaine. Among the earliest troubadours may also be reckoned Marcabru, a pupil of Chanson, from whose pen we have about 40 pieces, those which can be approximately dated ranging from 1135 to 1148 or thereabout. This poet has great originality of thought and style. His songs, several of which are historical, are free from the commonplaces of the class, and contain curious strictures on the corruptions of the time. The Golden Age Troubadours, Troubadours, and Troubaric. We cannot here do more than enumerate the leading troubadours and briefly indicate in what conditions the poetry was developed and through what circumstances it fell into decay and finally disappeared. Pere d'Alvena, who in certain respects must be classed with Marcabru, Arnulf Daniel, remarkable for his complicated versification, the inventor of the sestina, a poetic form for which Dante and Petrarch expressed an admiration difficult for us to understand. Arnulf de Mareuil, Bertrand de Born, now the most generally known of all the troubadours on account of the part he is said to have played both by his sword and his serviniusques in the struggle between Henry II of England and his rebel sons, though the importance of his part in the events of the time seems to have been greatly exaggerated. Pere Vidal of Toulouse, a poet of varied inspiration who grew rich with gifts bestowed on him by the greatest nobles of his time, Quirat de Borne, le Maxar dels Troubadours, and at any rate master in the art of the called close style, though he has also left us some songs of charming simplicity, Gauche Elm Fidet, from whom we have a touching lament on the death of Richard Coeur de Lion, Folquet of Marseille, the most powerful thinker among the poets of the South, who from being a merchant and troubadour became an abbot, and finally Bishop of Toulouse. Later troubadours, and foreign ones, as the troubadours started scattering from southern France after the Albigensian Crusade, the quality of the poetry decayed sharply. Dante, in his De Vulgari Eloquentia, mentions only authors of the previous generation as models of vernacular literature. However, the presence of troubadours in foreign courts engendered a number of imitators in Catalonia and Italy. Troubadours and society. It is not without interest to discover to what social classes the troubadours belonged. Many of them, there is no doubt, had a very humble origin. Bernard of Ventadour's father was a servant, Pere Vidal's a maker of furred garments, Perdigons a fisher. Others belonged to the bourgeoisie, Pere d'Alvena, for example, Pere Raymond of Toulouse, and Elias Fonsalada. Likewise we see merchants' sons as troubadours. This was the case with Folquet of Marseille and Aymeric de Peguelin. A great many were clerics, or at least studied for the church. For instance, Arnulf de Mareuil, Eucide Saint-Cirque, Aymeric de Bellenoy, Hugh Brunet, Pere Cardinal. Some had even taken orders, the monk of Montaudin and Gobert de Pucy-Bot. Ecclesiastical authority did not always tolerate this breach of discipline. Guy du Sel, canon and troubadour, was obliged by the injunction of the pontifical legate to give up his song-making. Folquet, too, renounced it when he took orders. One point is particularly striking: the number of monarchs and nobles who were troubadours. Raymond de Miraval, Pons de Capdul, Guilhem Adamar, Cadenet Perel, Raimbaud de Vaccaris, and many more. Some of this group were poor knights whose incomes were insufficient to support the rank, and took up poetry not merely for their own pleasure, but for the sake of the gifts to be obtained from the rich whose courts they frequented. A very different position was occupied by such wealthy and powerful people as William of Poitiers, Raimbaud de Aurignat, the Viscount of St. Antonin, Guillaume de Bergueda, and Black Hats. The profession was entirely dependent on the existence and prosperity of the feudal courts. The troubadours could hardly expect to obtain a livelihood from any other quarter than the generosity of the great. It will consequently be well to mention the more important at least of those princes who are known to have been patrons, and some of them practices, of the poetic art. They are arranged approximately in geographical order, and after each are inserted the names of those troubadours with whom they were connected. Patronage. While the troubadours found protectors in Catalonia, Castile and Italy, they do not seem to have been welcomed in French-speaking countries. This, however, must not be taken too absolutely. Occitan poetry was appreciated in the north of France. There is reason to believe that when Constance, daughter of one of the Counts of Arles, was married in 1001 to Robert, King of France, she brought along with her Provençal junglers. Poems by troubadours are quoted in the French romances of the beginning of the 13th century. Some of them are transcribed in the old collections of French songs, and the preacher Robert de Sorbonne informs us in a curious passage that one day a jungler sang a poem by Folquet of Marseille at the court of the King of France. Since the countries of the Langue d'Oil had a full developed literature of their own, the troubadours generally preferred to go to regions where they had less competition. The decline and fall of troubadour poetry was mainly due to political causes. When about the beginning of the 13th century the Albigensian crusade led by the French king had decimated and ruined the nobility and reduced to lasting poverty poverty, a part of the Occitan territories. The profession of troubadour ceased to be lucrative. It was then that many of those poets went to spend the last days in the north of Spain and Italy, where Occitan poetry had for more than one generation been highly esteemed. Following their example, other poets who were not natives of the south of France began to compose in Occitan, and this fashion continued till about the middle of the 13th century. They gradually abandoned the foreign tongue in northern Italy, and somewhat later in Catalonia, and took to singing the same airs in the local dialects. About the same time in the Provençal region, the flame of poetry had died out save in a few places, Narbonne, Rodez, Foix and Astarac, where it kept burning feebly for a little longer. In the 14th century, composition in the language of the country was still practiced, but the productions of this period are mainly works for instruction and edification. Translations from Latin are sometimes even from French, with an occasional romance. As for the poetry of the troubadours, it was dead forever. France. Henry the young king, son of Henry II of England, Bertrand de Born, Richard Coeur de Lion, Arnulf Daniel, Pere Vidal, Folquet de Marcella, Gauchelm-Fidet, Ermengarde of Narbonne, Bernard de Ventadour, Pere Rogier, Pere d'Alvena, Raymond V, Count of Toulouse, Bernard de Ventadour, Pere Rogier, Pere Raymond, Hugh Brunet, Pere Vidal, Folquet de Marcella, Bernard de Durfort, Raymond Vi, Count of Toulouse, Raymond de Miraval, Émeric de Peguihan, Émeric de Bellenoy, Adamar Le Negri, Savaric de Malio, Alfonso II, Count of Provence, Elias de Barjols, Raymond Berenguer IV, Count of Provence, Sordello, Raymond Geoffrey II of Marseille, Pere Vidal, Folquet de Marcella, Maria de Ventadorn, Gauchelm-Fidet, Guy du Sel, William VIII of Montpellier, Pere Raymond, Arnulf de Maroy, Folquet de Marcella, Guiraud de Calançon, Émeric de Salar, Dalphy d'Alvena, Peril, Perdigon, Pere de Mainsac, Gauchelm-Fidet, Eucide Saint-Cirque, Guillaume d'Esbou, Prince of Orange, Raimbaud de Vaqueries, Perdigon, Savaric de Malio, Jospin de Puchibot, Eucide Saint-Cirque, Black Hats, a Provençal noble, Cadenet, Jean de Aubusson, Sordello, Guillaume Figueira, Hugh II, Count of Rodez, Eucy Brunet, Bernard de Venzac, Henry I, Count of Rodez, Eucide Saint-Cirque, Hugh IV and Henry II, Counts of Rodez, Guiraut Riquier, Folquet de Lunel, Cerveri de Gironne, Bertrand Carbonel, Nuno Sanchez, Count of Roussillon, Émeric de Bellenoy, Bernard IV of Astarac, Guiraut Riquier, Emmanuel de Cescas, Aragon, Alfonso II of Aragon, Pere Rogier, Pere Raymond, Pere Vidal, Cadenet, Guiraut de Cabrera, Elias de Barjols, the monk of Montaudin, Hugh Brunet, Peter II of Aragon, Raymond de Miraval, Émeric de Peguilhan, Perdigon, Adamar Le Negri, Hugh of Saint-Cirq, James I of Aragon, Pere Cardinal, Bernard de Maruejols, Guiraut Riquier, at de Mons, Peter III of Aragon, Paulet of Marseille, Guiraut Riquier, Cerveri de Gironne, Castile and Leon, Alfonso IX of Leon, Elias Carel, Pere Rogier, Guiraut de Borneo, Émeric de Peguilhan, Hugh de Saint-Cirq, Alfonso VIII of Castile, Eucy de l'Escura, Alfonso X of Castile, Bertrand de Lamanon, Boniface Calvo, Guiraut Riquier, Folquet de Lund, Arnulf Plages, Bertrand Carbonel, Italy, Boniface II of Montferrat, Pere Vidal, Raimbaud de Vaqueries, Elias Carel, Gauchelm-Fidet, Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, Jean de Aubusson, Émeric de Peguilhan, Guillaume Figueira, Azovi, Marquis of Estenrup de Pegulhan, Rambertine de Bavleli, Azo 7, Marquis of Est-Emeric de Pegulhan. Form. Originally the poems of the troubadours were intended to be sung. The poet usually composed the music as well as the words, and in several cases he owed his fame more to his musical than to his literary ability. Two manuscripts preserve specimens of the music of the troubadours, but, though the subject has been recently investigated, we are hardly able to form a clear opinion of the originality and of the merits of these musical compositions. The following are the principal poetic forms which the troubadours employed. The oldest and most usual generic term is verse, by which is understood any composition intended to be sung, no matter what the subject. At the close of the 12th century, it became customary to call all verse treating of love canzo, the name verse being then more generally reserved for poems on other themes. The servantisque differs from the verse and the canzo only by its subject being for the most part devoted to moral and political topics. Pere Cardinal is celebrated for the servantisques he composed against the clergy of his time. The political poems of Bertrand de Born are servantisques. There is reason to believe that originally this word meant simply a poem composed by a servant, a man-at-arms. The servantisque is very frequently composed in the form, sometimes even with rhymes, of a love song having acquired some popularity, so that it might be sung to the same air. The tensin is a debate between two interlocutors, each of whom has a stanza or more generally a group of lines in turn. The Parchment is also a poetic debate, but it differs from the tensin insofar that the range of debate is limited. In the first stanza one of the partners proposes two alternatives, the other partner chooses one of them and defends it, the opposite side remaining to be defended by the original propounder. Often in a final couplet a judge or arbiter is appointed to decide between the parties. This poetic game is mentioned by William, Count of Poitiers, at the end of the 11th century. The pastoretta, afterwards pastorella, is in general an account of the love adventures of a knight with a shepherdess. All these classes have one form capable of endless variations, 5 or more stanzas and 1 or 2 envois. The dancer and ballada, intended to mark the time in dancing, are pieces with a refrain. The obad, which has also a refrain, bulsh, as the name indicates, awaking a morning song at the dawning of the day. All those classes are in stanzas. The discourse is not thus divided, and consequently it must be set to music right through. Its name is derived from the fact that, its component parts not being equal, there is a kind of discord between them. It is generally reserved for themes of love. Other kinds of lyric poems, sometimes with nothing new about them except the name, were developed in the Occitan regions, but those here mentioned are the more important. Narrative poetry. Although the lyrical poetry of the troubadours formed the most original part of Occitan literature, it was not the only kind. Narrative poetry, especially, received in Occitania a great development, and, thanks to recent discoveries, a considerable body of it has already become known. Several classes must be distinguished: the Chanson De Geste, legendary or apparently historical, the romance of adventure, and the novel. All these poems are in the form of chansons de geste, that is, in stanzas of indefinite length, with a single rhyme. One notable example is the saga of Gerard de Roussillon, a poem of 10,000 verses, which relates the struggles of Charles Martel with his powerful vassal the Burgundian Gerard of Roussillon. Gerard de Roussillon belongs only within certain limits to the Occitan literature, as it exists in two versions, one in Old Occitan and one in a hybrid language, which seems to have originated on the borders of Limousin and Poitou. Both are probably a recast of an older poem, probably either of French or Burgundian origin. which is no longer extant. To Limousin also seems to belong the poem of Iga and Morin, of which we have only a fragment so short that the subject cannot be clearly made out. Of less heroic character is the poem of Dorel and Beton, connected with the cycle of Charlemagne, but, judging by the romantic character of the events, more like a regular romance of adventure. We cannot, however, form a complete judgment in regard to it, as the only manuscript in which it has been preserved is defective at the close, and that to an amount there is no means of ascertaining. Midway between legend and history may be classified the Canzo d'Antioquia, a mere fragment of which 700 verses has been recovered in Madrid and published in Archives de l'Orient Latin, Volume E. This poem, which seems to have been composed by Grégoire Bicharda, mentioned in a 12th-century chronicle and written in Limousin, is one of the sources of the Spanish compilation La Gran Conquista de Ultramar. To history proper belongs the Song of the Albigensian Crusade, which, in its present state, is composed of two poems tacked on to each other. The first, containing the events from the beginning of the Crusade till 1213, is the work of a cleric named William of Tudela, a moderate supporter of the Crusaders. The second, from 1213 to 1218, is by a vehement opponent of the enterprise. The language and style of the two parts differs as well. Finally, around 1280, Guillaume Anelia, a native of Toulouse, composed a poem on the war carried on in Navarre by the French in 1276 and 1277. It is an historical work of little literary merit. Gerard of Roussillon, Iga and Morin and Dorel and Beton are in verses of 10, the others in verses of 12 syllables. The peculiarity of the versification in Gerard is that the pause in the line occurs after the sixth syllable, and not, as is usual, after the fourth. Like the Chanson De Geste, the romance of adventure is but slightly represented in the South, but it is to be remembered that many works of this class must have perished, as evidenced by the fact that, with few exceptions, the narrative poems which survived are known by a single manuscript only. Only three Provençal romances of adventure are extant: Geoffrey, Blandon of Cornwall and Guillaume de la Barre. The first two are connected with the Arthurian cycle. The romance of Guillaume de la Barre tells of strange story also found in Boccaccio's Decameron. It was finished in 1318, and is dedicated to a noble of Languedoc called Sicard de Monteau. Of these, only Geoffrey is considered of any literary merit. Connected with the romance of adventure is the novel, which is originally an account of an event newly happened. The novel must have been at first in the South what, as we see by the Decameron, it was in Italy. A society passed time with the wits in turn relating anecdotes, true or imaginary, which they think likely to amuse their auditors. But before long this kind of production was treated in verse, the form adopted being that of the romances of adventure, octosyllabic verses rhyming in pairs. Some of those novels which have come down to us may be ranked with the most graceful works in Provençal literature. Two are from the pen of the Catalan author Raimon Vidal de Besalú. 1. The Cascagillos is a treatment, not easily matched for elegance, of a frequently handled theme, the story of the husband who, in order to entrap his wife, takes the disguise of the lover whom she is expecting and receives with satisfaction blows intended, as he thinks, to him whose part he is playing. The other, The Judgment of Love, is the recital of a question of the law of love, departing considerably from the subjects usually treated in the novels. Mention may also be made of the novel of The Parrot by Arnaud de Carcassonne, in which which the principal character is a parrot of great eloquence and ability, who succeeds marvelously in securing the success of the amorous enterprises of his master. Novels came to be extended to the proportions of a long romance. Flamenca, which belongs to the novel type, has still over 8,000 verses, though the only Ms. of it has lost some leaves both at the beginning and at the end. This poem, composed in all probability in 1234, is the story of a lady who, by very ingenious devices, not unlike those employed in the Miles Gloriosus of Plautus, succeeds in eluding the vigilance of her jealous husband. No analysis can be given here of a work the action of which is highly complicated. Suffice it to remark that there is no book in medieval literature which betokens so much quickness of intellect and is so instructive in regard to the manners and usages of polite society in the 13th century. We know that novels were in great favor in the south of France, although the specimens preserved are not very numerous. Statements made by Francesco da Barberino, and recently brought to light, give us a glimpse of several works of this class which have been lost. For the Occitan territories, the novel spread into Catalonia, where we find in the 14th century a number of novels in verse very similar to the Provençal ones, and into Italy, where in general the prose form has been adopted.